Welcome. Welcome to The Story Matters. That's our one message, that stories, your story and our story and everyone's story really does matter. And so we have these conversations as a way of sharing together with another individual their stories, and stories that we can share together in terms of what does story mean and why is this all so important. So our partner today is Catherine Nichols. Catherine has lived here for a long time. She's been pastor of the Episcopal Church and a number of other things. And Pastor, we started out with a very specific point, namely the point of women in ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where we're going to start our conversation today. And as all conversations, you never know exactly where it's going to go.
That's the fun part,
That's
isn't
the
it?
fun part of it. So, Catherine, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to start with a story, kind of an incredible story. When I was a teenager, my father was a pastor. He would say, "I am a minister." And I really knew he had a good life. I watched him read a lot. His study was in our house. And he loved people, and I could see that he enjoyed most of his job. And I decided when I was a teenager that I'd like to be a minister too. And I remember saying out loud, "I'd like to be a minister, but girls can't." And one of the things that now, after 40, 50 years since 60 years since I said, "But girls can't," is that it never occurred to me to work to change that system. Never occurred to me to ask, how can we make it that girls can? But thank God for other people, because in the process of the Episcopal Church growing and changing, which happened over the next 30 years, women became what are now called priests in the Episcopal Church. But the next story is that when I went to college, I think I subconsciously thought, okay, I'm still interested in ministry. And unconsciously, I'm sure I thought, well, if I can't be one, maybe I can marry one. And so I was in the same town, Cambridge, Massachusetts, as the seminary where my father had studied, the Episcopal Theological School. So as a freshman in college, I walked over there and stood looking lost at the gate. And a nice young man came along. "Can I help you?" he said. And I said, yeah, my father came here and I'd like to see it. So he showed me around. It's a small campus. It took about 3 minutes. A wonderful little campus on Brattle Street in Cambridge. And I saw women walking by with their arms full of books.
Mm-hmm.
This is 1962. And I said to him, "Gosh, these women look like they're studying here. What do they do?" And he said, "Oh, they do religious education. They run Sunday schools and things. But they can get the same degrees now that we do. They take everything we do and they can get a master's degree. They take everything except for homiletics." Now, homiletics means preaching. Len, you know that, but I didn't know what homiletics was, but I was too embarrassed to ask.
Neither did I.
Really?
In those early days.
Homiletics is a word you don't hear when you're growing up, and lay people don't talk about homiletics. But anyway, they're walking around with books and they're getting the same degree,
Mm-hmm.
and this light bulb lit over my head, just like in the comics.
Mm-hmm.
Bright yellow light bulb over my head, and I remember it vividly. And I remember thinking, wow, they can study here and they can get a master's of divinity. And so I looked at him and said, "Can they become priests?" And he said, "Well, no." And the light bulb stayed on, and I said for the first time, "Why not?"
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at me and he literally began to sputter. And he said, well, they can't. I mean, would you want to be preached at by a pregnant priest? And I said, "No." And the light bulb went out. Would you want to be preached at?
Right.
So I think that even in a progressive seminary like the Episcopal Divinity School in 1962, it was pretty threatening to even think of women being in the priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
they might be pregnant. And what would that mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So fast forward some years, about 18 years or so. I was a musician. I had a master's in flute. That was the master's that I got, and I loved playing, and I loved performing, and I loved teaching. And I had been doing that for some years, and I had young children, and then they weren't so young, and they were coming home from school, and I was leaving to teach other people's children, because you can't teach kids flute during the day unless you're a public school teacher, which I was not. And all of a sudden, I realized there's something wrong with this picture. I'm not making very much money, but I'm leaving my children with an au pair girl and going off to teach others. So I happened to be living again after many years elsewhere in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where there were several schools. So I thought about business school, and I thought about social work school, and I thought about seminary. And I couldn't even fill out the application for business school. My then husband wished I would. I think he thought it would be neat if I made some money. Musicians don't make much. But the seminary, that same seminary that my father had gone to, was 20 blocks away. And I applied and got in very, very easily, and we moved across town. Children didn't change schools, husband didn't change jobs, and I was at the Episcopal Divinity School. Mm-hmm. And it really felt right. I loved it. I loved all the courses. I loved homiletics once I figured out what it was. So that's how I actually came in the back door to becoming a minister. It wasn't exactly a holy experience. It was a practical experience where, this was in 1979, the Episcopal Church had passed the ordination of women in 1976, and the first women ordained in 77. So all of a sudden, this was something I could do. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did. And I also remember, it's so interesting how things change and how you have to get used to all change. Mm-hmm. I remember the first time I saw a woman preside at the altar to what we call preside at the Eucharist or communion. And I was kind of horrified. I was in seminary. Mm-hmm. I was planning to become a minister, a woman minister, but I had never seen a woman stand behind the altar and preside at the Eucharist, because all I was used to was seeing my father up there. Mm-hmm. And he was male, so that was the norm. Mm-hmm. I love how norms change. Mm-hmm. So another story, years later, I was in Texas serving, and I became really good friends of a rabbi, and she was the first woman rabbi in her great big temple in Houston. And I was the first woman canon, which is what you are called if you're at a cathedral, in the Diocese of Texas, and that was pretty exciting. And we got together, we liked each other, plus we were in denominations where there were very few women at that point. I was the Diocese of Texas, I was number 5 of women, and there were 277 men, so we were really a minority. Mm-hmm. So I got together with her, and we were having coffee one day, and she said, the funniest thing happened the other day. I was pushing my young son, he was 4 at the time. This is the rabbi. She's pushing her son on the swing in a playground, and along comes one of her friends who's also a rabbi. And he and she have a nice conversation, and then off he goes. And she looks at her little boy and she says, "Do you know, George is a rabbi too?" And her little boy says, "He can't be. He's a man." And that's how the norm changed.
And that's how the norm.
I loved that story. So I had the real privilege of being the first in every church I was in for a while. The first church was a suburban parish in Houston, and they had never had a woman priest. And the Texas women often would come up to me and say, "You're a lady priest? What do we call you?" That was the Texas accent. I loved it.
Did you have an answer for that?
My answer was, "Please call me Catherine." And they'd say, "But we call Father Jones, Father Jones. Do you want to be Mother Nichols?" "No, thank you. My children call me Mother." And actually, in the cathedral where I served, there was a man who showed that he respected that I really was a priest. he called me Father.
Hmm.
And that felt pretty weird. But I didn't say anything the first time. I was surprised. And the second time he called me Father, I realized he was showing respect.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciated that. Often walking on the street in my collar, people would see me and they'd say, "Hello, Mother," and they would mean Reverend Mother.
Mm-hmm.
They would think that I was a nun, although I've never known nuns, unless they're ordained, who wore collars, but they wear uniforms, you know, maybe a whipple, and there I was in this funny-looking thing. So that was a part of it, too. Even the clothing was a part of it. And that reminds me of another story. So I'm in seminary, and I'm about to be ordained. It's senior year, and I write to Almy, which is the, not publishing house, the house for vestments and clergy shirts and paraphernalia that clergy and churches need. So I write, this is in the old days, I write to Almy and say, "May I please have 3 clergy shirts? I'm about to be ordained." And they wrote back and said, "We can't do it. Our tailors don't know how to tailor shirts for women." Isn't that ridiculous?
Yeah.
But I had a friend who was a tailor, and so I bought some really neat fabric with flowers on it, and my first clergy shirts were made by tailors, and they were the fabric I picked out myself. One was pink, one was blue, and one had little
And
strawberries.
How was that received?
People would say, "Oh, I love your shirt." Or your blouse. Actually, you don't say shirt, you say blouse if it's a woman. "Where'd you get that?" In Texas, "Where'd you get that shirt? I want one too," would some of my priest colleagues, women priest colleagues would say. And some of them found tailors. But by then, and this was a few years later, Almy's tailors learned how to make women's shirts, women's clergy shirts.
How did the attitude change from the earliest time when this seemed inconceivable to the time when women became accepted?
And that it became, I think it took 20 years before it seemed normal for women to be clergy. Because, as you know, anytime something is new for you, "Oh, I live in Vermont, you know, I've never known an African American person." And then you make friends in college with an African American person, and you realize that that is the same, their skin is only the only difference. "I've never known a lady priest before." And then I'm their priest, and maybe I visit them in the hospital, and they come to accept what that means, even if at first they didn't think it was such a good idea.
So is it kind of one person at a time?
I think it's 2 things. I think it's one person at a time personally, but I also think that it's collective, that when you see a group of women clergy, perhaps at a meeting or at lunch, 3 women in collars talking and laughing and eating together, it becomes more normal. In 1988, I went to Canterbury, England, for the Lambeth Conference of Bishops, which is a worldwide gathering of worldwide Anglican bishops from all the English colonies where the Episcopal Church, called the Anglican Church, is functions. And the presiding bishop at the time, Ed Browning of the United States Episcopal Church, asked those of us who had the money to go overseas and pay for it ourselves, to be what was called the women's presence at Lambeth, because there were many provinces of the Episcopal Church where women's ordination was a horrendous idea. This was still early on, 1988, we had ordained women for 9 years. Canada had ordained women for a little longer. There were a couple of women priests in Brazil, interestingly enough. And so we had a center in downtown Canterbury that was an old priory, 15th century building. It was extraordinary. And women who were lay and ordained, and a few men who were in the support of women's ordination, set up exhibits of pictures of women presiding at the Eucharist and women in their collars. And we were asked to wear our collars, and whenever we were up at the University of Kent, which is actually where the conference of bishops meets, to walk around the campus in our collars, especially so that those bishops who either were very opposed on theological grounds, and I'll talk about that in a minute, or just had never seen one, so they could see that we weren't weird, we didn't walk around burning our bras, we weren't horrendous feminists. We were feminists. Most of us called ourselves feminists, but we weren't scary, and we were normal people.
Yeah, right. And acting responsibly.
Responsibly, right, and faithfully, and joining in worship, and it was a real privilege.
The response that said, "Would you like to hear a pregnant priest, preaching the gospel?" That sounds like that was a really rational response in the mind of the person who asked the question. Did you get other kinds of responses like that? Like that offered reasons why women should not?
Well, yeah, because
that's really clear.
Jesus didn't have any women apostles, quote unquote.
Okay.
Well, he did, but they weren't named in the New Testament. There were actually women priests in the early church, scholars have discovered. So that argument doesn't hold much water, but that was one of the arguments.
And what about what were the emotional reactions against that?
To personally, or to women as clergy?
Either one.
Well, the emotional to the concept of women as clergy was women can't preach. They have high voices, and they don't know how to speak with authority, so they shouldn't be in the pulpit. That was one. And another was women have families and they should stay home and take care of their children. So that was part of it. The personal experiences I had, there were a couple that were very interesting. The first women who were ordained about 5 years before I was, were actually, some of them were spat upon. When they gave communion, they were pinched or spat upon. My experience was the first time I presided at the Eucharist at this cathedral in Houston where I served. Wonderful, wonderful place, progressive congregation. But one man walked up to an usher and he said, "I can't take communion because a priest hasn't blessed it." And the usher said, "Oh, yes, she has." And he turned and walked out, and he didn't ever come back.
Okay.
I didn't experience that, but I was told by the usher, and I thought, oh, isn't that too bad?
And so you've heard stories from your friends?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, my other most conscious personal experience was when I entered a party of the Altar Guild at the same cathedral. They had an Advent party every year, and the clergy were invited. I walked in the door, and 3 women turned their backs. And so I, at the time, thought, well, they're just chatting and they don't want somebody to join them. And I went to the right and entered another room and continued with the party. But on reflection, I realized they were turning their backs because they just didn't think a woman should be a priest. And my favorite story is there was a wonderful woman who, she and her sister were in their 90s. They were devout Episcopalians. They had run an Episcopal bookstore in Houston, and they were both homebound, and I visited them and took them communion every other month or so, and I just loved them. And one day, Ama Lee said to me, "Well, I don't believe in women priests, but I want you to bury me." So, as you said,
Right.
Personal experience makes a big difference.
It does, and you never know quite where it's going to go.
You sure don't.
And some of your strongest critics can eventually become good friends because of what has happened. Is that attitude, do you think, lessening and going?
Oh, very much so. Yeah, this is 40 years, almost 40 years since the first. It is 40 years.
It is 40.
77.
So we're doing a celebration here.
That's right. Let's
Yeah.
celebrate
Yeah.
40 years of women in the priesthood. My father was thrilled when his daughter went to seminary because he didn't have any sons, and I think it was something that he'd never thought of, and it was pretty exciting.
It's all part of that whole vast process of how, or slow, steady process of how things change, what comes in and what goes what goes out.
I'm not sure it's always steady.
No.
Because I think it happens in eruptions.
Eruptions.
You know, women are going to be ordained, and then 40 years later,
Right.
oh yeah, we have women and men priests at our church.
Mm-hmm.
The normalizing of women in the clergy was bumpy at first, very bumpy at first.
Do you think through this experience women have wanted to tell their story,
Oh yeah.
or have they hesitated? And what would cause them to hesitate in this?
Well, that's an interesting question. I've heard so many women tell their stories and what it was like when there was a bomb threat at one of my friend's ordinations. That was in Texas. The woman who was the second ordained in that diocese. A bomb threat. I mean, come on. And then at that same ordination, her bishop wasn't going to go. She was being ordained by a bishop from another diocese who was more progressive and had supported her through this whole seminary and process towards ordination. And the bishop's assistant said, well, Bishop, are you going to go to Helen's ordination? And he said, I don't think so. And his associate said, I think you might want to. And he did. And actually, at my ordination, in Texas, I was ordained a deacon in Massachusetts and then priest in Texas. The Bishop of Texas ordained me for the Bishop of Massachusetts, John Coburn, and the Bishop of Texas, Ben Benitez, had never ordained a woman before, and he was really excited. I was pretty thrilled to be being ordained, and he was, in a way, even more excited about ordaining the first woman, his first woman, to the priesthood.
Is your perception that women in ministry is spreading in most denominations, most organizations? It's not.
Yes, except
still an issue, and will be for a while, or quite a while, or
in the Roman
maybe
Catholic
forever
Church.
In the Roman Catholic Church.
Oh, I think someday they'll ordain women, but I don't think it'll be until our grandchildren are old, perhaps. But I think it's so much more widely accepted in the mainline denominations. And some denominations ordained women 150 years ago. Some of the more progressive, I don't know what denomination it was, but there were some Pentecostals who had women preachers and clergy. They didn't call themselves clergy, really. They called themselves preachers. They didn't go to seminary.
Yes.
And that wasn't new with them.
No.
Yeah.
So, are you hopeful?
You mean for the Roman Catholic Church?
Well, no, for
The role of women in the church?
the role of women in the church. And
I'm satisfied with the role of women in the church. I'm discouraged about the church because so few younger people go to church now. Your congregation and my congregation where we worship are mostly, not all, but mostly gray-headed like us. And I think the church will be a very different place in 20 years, and I don't know what it will be like.
No, I'm sure we don't.
What do you think it'll be like?
I really don't know. The question for me is, this is I guess my conviction is, this is a time to think clearly, and this is a time to take venturesome steps, and because institutions need to be supported and they don't just take care of themselves, and they don't just take care of us.
Oh, they don't take care of us.
And that's led to a lot of disappointment on the part of individuals. But they don't take care of us. You have to care for the institutions. So,
Yeah.
when I was a superintendent, I had two churches that were all senior citizens, and one built a brand new building.
No kidding.
And out of that, gradually, they began to get a family, and then they got two families. And I haven't been there back in New Jersey for a while, so I don't quite know where that is. But they took the steps of building the building, and everybody was in the retirement age.
If you build it, they will come.
Right. And the other did it in the framework of a facility for seniors, and this was the community house, and they turned the community house into the place where the church gathers.
Ah.
So I have hopes no matter what the age is.
Mm.
But on the other hand, there's no guarantee. And,
No.
and there's a lot of work to be done to be related to people and the world
Right.
and the task.
Right.
And not to have things block us, such
Right.
as gender.
Right.
uh,
Or sexual
so-
persuasion.
or sexual persuasion.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, the institution is what can slow us down. The maintenance of a building with a small group of people.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that the churches that are growing are the ones that are reaching out, like your retired friends.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also think there'll be more churches like the early church that will meet in homes or in storefronts or
Right.
in other places, so they don't have this enormous
Building
budgetary problem.
Right.
Yeah.
So it could be and I think it should be a very exciting time.
It is an exciting time.
It'll be different.
Everything changes,
It'll be different.
and that's, I think, that's good.
And the role of women in this change has been incredible.
Oh, it's been a real privilege to be a part of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add?
Well, the one thing I wanted to add is that Vermont, having had one of the first women governors, had the first woman diocesan bishop. A diocesan is a bishop who's in charge of the diocese.
Mm-hmm.
We have assistant bishops and suffragan bishops, and we elect them too. But Vermont elected Mary Adelia MacLeod,
Right.
and that was such a thrill to be in on that and have our state be the one that came up with the first bishop.
Well, that's a good story to end on. Well, thank you.
You're
Catherine,
so welcome.
for having this time.
Well, thank you for having
Enjoyed
me.
the conversation. So
It was fun. It went by fast.
yes, it does. So, have good conversations this week.
Oh,
Find people to talk to. Find people to listen to. Listen to them. Let them listen to you. Listening is what is necessary in order to have a story. So enjoy your stories, enjoy your listening, enjoy your life.